May 5th, year 842 of the Eastern Reckoning. Windhaven Citadel, Aramuff's northern cliffs. 32 people crowd inside a leaking stone chamber, where a dying emperor gasps his final breaths. The torches hiss against the damp air. Mold creeps up the walls like black veins. A bucket beside the bed is already half filled with dark, reddish vomit. The smell, sweat, iron, sickness hangs so heavy it burns the nose. On the straw mattress lies Emperor Kael Aramir, once the most feared man on the eastern continent. His skin is wax yellow. His lips tremble with fever. His hair, once bound in gold rings, is now thin as brush fighters. He weighs maybe 130 pounds, down from the warrior who once carried full armor with ease. His eyelids flutter. Sometimes he speaks in the old Aramese tongue, sometimes in the Western dialect he learned during the campaign of 7 kingdoms, and sometimes only in indistinct murmurs. "Where is Lyra? Bring the banners. Don't let the realm break." The room is not filled with generals or counselors. It holds only a handful of loyalists who followed him into exile after the collapse of his empire. Captain Eldrick Thorne, Lady Mirava of Dulun, 2 young servants, 3 foreign physicians arguing over which herbs might delay his death, several local dock workers assigned as guards, and even a few indentured laborers from the neighboring fishing village. From a ruler of 32 million to barely 32. Just 6 years earlier, Kael had led the largest army Aramuth had ever assembled. An iron tide of 400,000 soldiers across the Frostlands in an attempt to subdue the northern tribes. But winter devoured them before battle ever could. Hunger, frostbite, plague, and the endless night sky swallowed the campaign whole. When the army finally broke, so did the empire. The nobles denounced him. The western barons staged their revolt, and the eastern kingdoms, newly freed, financed the coalition that finally drove him from the capital. Kael surrendered his throne at the marble gates and accepted exile at Windhaven, once a merchant outpost, now a forgotten ruin perched above a storming sea. But the story of his death begins earlier, months before this room, before this bed, before the coughing of blood stained his nights. It begins on the day he escaped exile for the first time. The date was March 1st, year 836. A fishing vessel named the Lantern carried Kael and 30 loyal soldiers across the silent strait. The sea fog wrapped the boat in ghostly gray as they approached the mainland. They had only a dozen spears, a few crates of scavenged armor, and a plan that could only be described as madness. March toward the capital and see who joins. The coalition's puppet king, Rowan III, sat on Aramuth's throne, propped up by foreign armies and local nobles anxious to erase Kael's legacy. Taxes had doubled. Veterans were dismissed without pensions. The trade guilds were strangled by foreign tariffs. The people whispered of famine. Aramuth was a kingdom wearing someone else's crown. Kael knew the nation's wounds. He had spent months reading smuggled bulletins and letters from supporters. So he returned, not with an army this time, but with a spark. By the time the Lantern reached the port of Vilcrest, Kael stood on the dock as villagers watched in stunned silence. They expected a ghost.
Instead, they saw the man who had once united the eastern kingdoms under a single banner. His soldiers marched behind him in simple formation, 30 men against a world. 5 miles inland, the first test came. A regiment of 400 kingdom soldiers blocked the road. Their captain, armored in foreign steel, raised his hand. "Kael Aramir, by decree of King Rowan III, you are to be seized and delivered to the high tribunal." Kael stepped forward alone. No armor, no sword, only the wind pulling at his travel cloak. He opened his arms wide. "If one of you wishes to claim reward for killing me, here is your chance. I do not resist." Silence. Then a soldier in the back shouted, "Long live the sovereign!" Another echoed him, then another. Within minutes, the entire regiment joined Kael, dropping the king's banner in the dirt. It happened again the next day, and the next. By the time Kael reached the capital's outer ring, 6,000 soldiers marched at his back. On March 14th, Rowan III fled the capital under cover of night. Kael entered the city without shedding a drop of blood. Crowds filled the streets, chanting, singing, reaching to touch his cloak. Mothers lifted children onto their shoulders to see him. Old veterans bowed and wept openly. The empire was reborn in 14 days. But rebirth came at a price the world was unwilling to pay. Because in the courts of the eastern kingdoms, in Kaldur, Saul, and the Isles of Norwin, the moment Kael returned, fear spread like fire. They had defeated him once. They would not allow him to rise again. Within a fortnight, the Grand Coalition of 7 Realms declared him an outlaw to all nations. Their message was simple. There will be no truce with Kael Aramir, no negotiation, only his destruction. And so the final battle began. Not in snow this time, but in sunlight.
June 18th, year 836. Starwind Ridge, 20 miles north of the capital. The ground trembled beneath thousands of boots as Kael surveyed the valley before dawn. 2 armies blocked his future, the Western legions under Lord Commander Rowan, and to the east, marching swiftly, the iron host of Kaldur. He did not have to defeat the world, only the first wave. His army, now 72,000 strong, looked impressive on paper. In truth, nearly half were hastily armed villagers, retired soldiers, and youths who had marched more on hope than on training. Still, Kael believed he had one chance. Break Rowan's army before the Iron Host arrives. A single victory might force negotiations, might buy time, might save the empire. At dawn, the horn sounded. Kael drew a deep breath. "For Aramuth," he whispered. The battle began with a roar of iron and smoke. Aramuth's cannons fired from the ridge, but the night's rainfall turned the soil to sludge. Cannon wheels sank, horses slipped. Shots meant to tear through lines instead buried themselves in the softened earth. Kael cursed under his breath. The ridge that should have been his strength became his burden. At midday, the fight for Halamir Farm began. It was supposed to be a diversion, draw Rowan's men away from the center. But Lord Eric Val, one of Kael's commanders, pushed too hard. Soon thousands were locked in brutal, close-quarters combat inside the stone courtyards. Kael shouted orders, but the farm swallowed them like a beast. By 2 p.m., Captain Eldrick Thorne, his most loyal commander, rode to him through smoke and chaos. "My emperor, Kael, the center weakens. The villagers cannot hold. We must push forward before the iron host arrives." Kael nodded, sweat dripping from his brow. His ribs ached. His head throbbed with the familiar pain he'd been hiding for months. He ordered, "Ready the Storm Guard." The Storm Guard, his elite veterans, undefeated in 20 years. They were his last reserve, his pride, his hope. He hesitated only a moment before lifting his hand. "Send them." At 3:40 p.m., the Storm Guard marched across the valley. Their armor glimmered in the fading afternoon sun. They moved with the discipline of men who had survived wars that crushed lesser armies. Kael watched from the ridge, heart hammering. If the Storm Guard broke through, the ridge could still be won. But then, a horn echoed from the east. Not his, not Rovin's. The Iron Host had arrived. 30,000 armored soldiers of Kaldur thundered toward the right flank, their banners, black wolves on silver, rippling like storm clouds. Kael's breath caught. "We're out of time." He ordered Eldrick to divert 10,000 men to stall the Iron Host. Eldrick obeyed without hesitation, but both men knew the truth. It was not enough. At 6 p.m., screams rose along the center. Kael's gaze snapped downward. The Storm Guard, who had never broken formation in 2 decades, staggered under Rovin's hidden reserve units. Arrows rained upon them. Pikes surged forward. Kael leapt onto his horse. "Sound the rally horn," he roared. He galloped down the ridge, shouting, "Hold the line! Hold it!" His voice cracked through the smoke. Some soldiers lifted their heads, others fought harder. But it was not enough. A whisper spread across the valley, soft at first. "The Storm Guard are retreating." Retreating. His undefeated elite. The whisper grew into a panic, then into a scream. Kael's chest tightened as if pierced. Around him, formations wavered, then split. Rovin's army surged. The Iron Host smashed the right flank. Kael's forces crumbled like sand under flood. Eldrick rode up beside him, blood streaming from his forehead. "My Emperor, Kael, we must withdraw, now, or none of us will live to warn the capital." Kael stared at the battlefield, the army he rebuilt, the hope he rekindled, breaking apart in the ruins of one terrible moment. Then he nodded, once. They fled south under cover of darkness. Behind them lay tens of thousands of fallen soldiers, and the last dawn of the Aramuth Empire. Within days, Kael reached Windhaven Citadel. Too sick to continue, too hunted to remain free. He abdicated once more. This time with no conditions, no heir, no bargaining. Just surrender. The coalition spared his life, but condemned him to live out his final years in the storm-beaten fortress where, 6 years later, he now lies dying. And the 32 people around his deathbed remain the last who still believe in him. The empire is gone, but the memory, the warning, remains. Power can conquer nations, but it cannot conquer the consequences of its own ambition.